All right, it's almost that Valentine's Day, so this is based on Valentine's Day, loosely. We most often associate 1 Corinthians 13 with a wedding ceremony. We've heard it many times, but what if we listen to the scripture in broader terms? Let's replace our romantic definition of love as we listen with open hearts. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but not of love, I am a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful. It is not arrogant or rude. Love does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrong, but rejoices in the right. Love bears all things, believes all things, and hopes all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. But when the perfect comes, the imperfect will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, and then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall understand fully, even as I have been fully understood. So faith, hope, love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Will you please pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, we pray that we can love each day the way you love, that we can be patient with someone who may be slowing our progress, that we can listen with open minds and hearts to persons whose beliefs are not our own, that we will cheer the success of others without jealousy or resentment. Be with us as we bear adversity, strengthen our faith, and keep our hope alive. We especially lift up our care receivers to you. Help us to listen with love. Show us ways to spread love to each other in person or in creative ways yet to be discovered. As we pray this in the name of Jesus Christ, who loves each one of us. Amen. Do you get this? Thank you.
So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our guest lecturer, Dr. John Hopper. He's going to be delivering the second lecture of our Sandy Talbot speaker series. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank Sandy again, although she couldn't be here tonight, for all of her hard work on behalf of First Presbyterian Church. And it has been truly outstanding, and we are so grateful and are happy that we're able to have this speaker series in her honor. Dr. Harper is a board-certified physician with specializations in addiction medicine, pediatrics, and adult internal medicine. He's been an active clinician and medical educator in Southeast Michigan since 1994. He's an adjunct clinical professor at three institutions, Central Michigan University, Georgetown University, and Wayne State University. And he's employed by Trinity Health IHA Medical Group, providing clinical care in hospital medicine and addiction medicine. The title of his presentation tonight is Just the Facts, Cannabis in Michigan. And without further ado, Dr. Harper. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to you all being here tonight. I realize it's the night after the Super Bowl, the night before Thanksgiving, and I know there's people online as well, so I really appreciate your interest in this topic. I think as you heard, I do have a number of faculty appointments. That just represents the fact that I did addiction medicine before there were very many faculty. And I do actually have a U of M appointment, which Mary did point out as well. But so my perspective comes from my clinical work, and this presentation today is really just, what do I think the community should know about cannabis in the year 2023? As you heard, I am certified in adult medicine as well as pediatrics, and I've worked with adolescents throughout my career, although it's never been the dominant part of my practice, but it does happen to be a population that not a lot of people want to work with, and I'm often asked, especially when there's a drug use problem, to be involved. So I started my career at Wayne State as a medical student, did my training down at North Carolina, University of North Carolina, and was a pediatric chief resident down there, did a lot of adolescent work down there, joined the faculty again at Wayne State after I finished residency, and there established the Substance Abuse Research Division, where we did a lot of opioid addiction research. And for 3 years, I was the medical director at Brighton Hospital, which you might be familiar with. It's actually the second oldest treatment hospital in the country. And since 2008, I've been working with Trinity Health, and we actually have the only addiction medicine fellowship in the state. It's a one-year training program for physicians, so started that a few years ago, and actually Trinity Grand Rapids just welcomed the second program for the state. So yeah, I'm going to give you a clinical perspective. I am going to try to present a fact-based perspective, but I'm also going to tell you the bottom line because it is the night after the Super Bowl. The bottom line is that, I really appreciated the devotional talking about love, and really, my clinical work is about compassion for patients, and in particular, I think as a society, we really need compassion for those who are affected by substance use disorder. In particular, adolescents are particularly vulnerable to substance use. And as a result, it's really our obligation as a society to have compassion for our adolescents and really try to protect developing brains from exposure to alcohol, nicotine, cannabis, and other drugs. And I think that's really why I'm here today, is really to get you to know what the facts are and think about perhaps a different perspective on this. So these are the topics we're going to address. I think probably at some point about halfway through, we'll take some questions from the audience as well as from online. And we have plenty of time for questions at the end as well. Again, I'm not going to, I think for each topic here, we'll just have a few slides. I'm not going to get too heavy into the science, just what I think you need to know. So let's start with the topic of cannabis itself. So the plant Cannabis sativa, the hemp plant, is actually a pretty boring plant by itself. In its native state, there's a relatively low concentration of the active ingredient tetrahydrocannabidiol. That's, basically the thing that people want. And there's also not that much cannabidiol either, and that's what gets hyped as sort of having some medical component as well. Now, there are many other types of cannabinoids, and I'll tell you, I've been doing addiction work for a long time, and it's one of the most complex drugs in terms of human interaction and biology, and we'll talk a little bit about it today, but it's also an area we don't know nearly enough about. So there's variable amounts of THC, and there is cannabis indica, which does have increased amount of THC, but sativa is the one that we're all known for. During this talk, I'll use the term cannabis and marijuana somewhat interchangeably, but it is worth noting marijuana is a product of the cannabis plant, and cannabis is a variety of different plants. And I think many of you are aware that the cannabis of today is not the cannabis of Woodstock. Potency for THC, the psychoactive ingredient, the thing that gets you high, was quite low in the 60s, less than 3%. And today there are products that have literally 60, 70% THC products. Now, there is a little bit of controversy because methods for sampling and measuring vary, and if they're looking at the DEA stockpile of drugs that may have been harvested back in the 60s and you check it today, perhaps some of the THC is gone. But there's no doubt that, as you can see on this graph here, 3 or 4% is what we were looking at even back in the 90s, and now 2014, 12%. And this is just for street pot, not for what we're talking about in terms of legal products, which, if we look at this next slide here, these are the many different formulations of cannabis that are available. So there's the smoked joint or the blunt, which is rolled with tobacco. There's the water pipe, and we have increasing potency as you go down. So there is THC resin that's extracted with butane, and it forms a very hard, flammable product here called shatter. And edibles can have anywhere from 5 to 100 milligrams of THC per product. So, you know, a smoked joint might have just a few milligrams in it. So we're talking about something that has, 20 times the potency of the pot of the Woodstock era. And then we should talk about CBD, because of course that has a lot of hype as well. And most products that out there that say they're CBD don't really have a lot of CBD in it. And again, I'm an addiction specialist, so we're doing urine toxicology testing on lots of people, and I have many, many patients who tell me, I bought this CBD product, I'm using CBD, and I say, yeah, but your urine shows you've got THC in it. And that's one of the reasons that you like the CBD products, because CBD by itself is not a reinforcing drug. It's not something that you want to keep using or taking. And you really have no idea what you're getting in most of these products, and there are a number of impurities. And then one of the problems that we certainly have seen a little less in the last couple of years, but prior to the pandemic, you heard a lot about synthetic cannabinoids. So these are manufactured in the lab, so THC variants that are made in a lab, and then they can be sprayed on different kinds of organic plant matter, and then people smoke them the way they would smoke other things. And you've heard some of the stories about people having acute psychosis from these because they have very different properties from typical THC. And because these chemical compounds are readily created, a lot of them aren't regulated, and you can see these products sold at gas stations, maybe not right up above the counter, but they're there. And so Kush and Spice are just some names, street names for some of the synthetic cannabinoids, which can be quite problematic. So that's kind of, I think, the background for where we're at with marijuana and cannabis. Let's just talk a little bit about the biology of cannabis. Now, it is worth noting that we don't know nearly as much as we'd like to know. And a lot of that does have to do with the fact that cannabis has been regulated by the Drug Enforcement Agency as a Schedule I drug. So that's a drug that has no therapeutic use. So it's in the same category as heroin. Now, that's been a problem. So as someone who used to do research with controlled substances, trying to do research with Schedule I drugs is a whole nother level of research. So we did research with opiates. We did a lot of the founding work for the treatment of opiate use disorder with buprenorphine. It was easier to give people an opiate than it is cannabis. All your staff have to be trained. There's background checks. It's very complicated. So as a result, we in the United States are really far behind in what we need to know about cannabis biology because, let's face it, it's not as bad as heroin. And this is something that, again, some countries, Israel has done a lot more, for example, with cannabis biology. But the interesting thing here is if you look at the brain's natural neurotransmitter, anandamide, this is the brain chemical that goes into the receptors of cannabis, looks just like THC, fits nicely into these well-distributed areas of the brain, which includes movement, vision, coordination, memory, judgment, all areas that are impaired by cannabis. Well, there's lots of receptors there for the cannabinoids. So whether it's anandamide, this is actually probably the mediator of the runner's high, for example. You hear a lot of talk about dopamine, but this is actually probably what mediates a lot of pleasurable sensations. So CB1, that's one of the receptors, lots of it in the brain. There are other places in the body too where cannabis has activity, the immune system in particular, but that's much more limited in distribution. And then, so when we think about some of the areas that are particularly affected by marijuana, coordination, no surprise there. The hippocampus, the main driver of memory. The neocortex, the decision-making part of the brain. All these highly affected by cannabinoids. And then to other degrees, appetite, the hypothalamus, decision around planning and decision-making in the basal ganglia, coordination in the basal ganglia, also working with the cerebellum. The feeling of reward, that's right here in the deep parts of the brain. And then anxiety, emotion, and fear, lots of receptors in the amygdala. So, again, our brains were made to like drugs like cannabis. And likewise, we have, if you've read Michael Pollan's work, it's a mutual relationship where we like the plant likes us, the plant is propagated by us because we like it, the plant gets more like what we like, and we propagate it more. So that's what agriculture is all about. So whether it's marijuana or apples, there is a relationship between us and these plants. So what are the trends? And I think this is particularly important to keep in light of what's going on with the pandemic and the growing legalization of cannabinoids here. So this is data from National Institute on Drug Abuse, and this is one of the major sources of data on adolescent use, and they do surveys of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. And what we can see is past year marijuana use by 12th graders in 2020 was around 35%. So at least 35%, a third of kids had tried marijuana in the past year. And you can see lower percentages for 10th and 8th graders. This is always the most concerning group here, the kids who are using daily. So 7% of 12th graders report daily marijuana use. Sometimes, you'll see some attrition as well. So some of the daily 10th graders may have dropped out by the 12th grade here. And so if we look at the 12th grade age population, 17-year-old kids, there's a lot more than 7% who are using daily. And we're in Ann Arbor, so we have to mention Monitoring the Future because this is one of the largest longitudinal studies of adolescent drug use in the United States. It also looks at 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. And you can see there's data that goes back to the 70s in terms of marijuana use. And this, again, is lifetime use. So have you ever used marijuana in your lifetime? And, before the conference, we were looking the peak marijuana use in the United States in terms of lifetime use. This is right when I graduated from high school, 1980. And so right here is where we had the highest levels of marijuana use. And you can see we're not nearly at that level right now, but it's still 40 to 45%. Half of kids have tried marijuana. And there is a drop with the pandemic. Now the data is showing this is probably rebounding, but it's not finalized yet. So this is lifetime use, but again, the most concerning thing is the daily use. So daily use, 11, 12% back in 1980, we're more like 6, 7% in the 12th grade population right now. And some of the reasons, though, that this is problematic is that vaping is a much more potent delivery form of marijuana than the smoke joint. And you already saw how the concentration and the purity and the potency is much greater now, too. So this is actually from a while ago, 2015, in Connecticut, So this is actually, a sample not dissimilar to Ann Arbor in terms of the population. So Connecticut high school students in a fairly affluent community, and they were found about 20 to 25% of e-cigarette users were vaping cannabis. So these e-cigarette devices make it much easier to smoke a more potent product. So it's definitely a problem. And so when it comes to vaping cannabis, something even more concerning than use overall, we can see there was a big decrease in 10th graders during the pandemic, so daily use almost dropped by half. 12th graders probably a little more mobile, maybe 10th graders more dependent on their friends seeing them at school, but in any case, still not an insignificant number of people being affected by daily marijuana use. And then this is actually the last slide in this section, but it's a really important concept and one that I think you'll take with you. It's true for pretty much all drugs, is that there's an inverse correlation between use, which goes up, when perceived risk goes down. And again, as we've already said, peak marijuana use here, late 70s, early 80s in the United States, also corresponded with a time when there was generally little perceived risk from marijuana use. And you can see in the 90s, marijuana risk perceptions went up. This is as cocaine was rising in use, and use went down here. So you can see we're at a relatively low level now of perceived risk. Not the lowest we've been, but we're also, at a fairly high level of use. So, the question for us as a community is what drives this and how do we change this curve? So one thing is, I'm just going to be, real, maybe this is not a fact, but I think it is. Marijuana is not medicine. It's soup. Whatever cannabis product you're using, are there some potentially beneficial ingredients in there? Absolutely. Are there some potentially harmful ingredients in there? Absolutely. And so for the right person, soup might be good for the cold, but if there's too much salt and you have high blood pressure, it's not a good combination. Likewise for cannabis, there are some people who it's not a good combination with their biology and their brain. So, whatever people are buying in a dispensary that's medicine, they're going to an apothecary, basically. And, obviously I'm an allopathic physician. I'm not a homeopath. I don't practice allopathic medicine. It's sort of abhorrent to me that doctors are asked to sign off on these cards for patients for something that we actually have no training for and we don't really know what we're giving them. It's not a prescription, but this is medical cannabis. There's only 3 products in the United States that I'm licensed and trained to understand. And none of these are blockbuster drugs. Marinol's been around for a long time. I've probably prescribed it 3 or 4 times. It's approved for nausea related to chemotherapy and AIDS wasting, which pretty much nobody gets AIDS wasting anymore. We've really changed that into a chronic disease. So there's lots of drugs for nausea, and there's very little indication for using this for nausea. People like the feeling. It's a synthetic THC. Likewise, Nabilone is a synthetic THC, and it's also approved for nausea for chemotherapy. But you're going to get a buzz from it too, and people like that, and if you're nauseated and you're getting chemotherapy, you might want a buzz, and maybe that's okay. And then cannabidiol is FDA approved for seizures in children. Again, it's a very limited population that responds to this, very specific types of seizures. It's great for those kids that it works for. Nobody's asking to have this prescribed for them because it gives you no high. And for all the benefits that cannabidiol will try to tell you about in terms of joint health and things like that, I'm fairly confident that in my lifetime, none of these drugs are going to have some newfound application that we don't already know about? Are there potentially helpful compounds within the cannabis plant? Yes. Are they really going to change medicine as we know it and really change lives? Probably not. I think this is a good time to take a quick break and, well, actually, let's talk about marijuana as big business, and then we'll talk about we'll answer questions before consequences. So, the marijuana lobby is really powerful, and they're growing in strength because they bring in a lot of tax dollars. And we really are looking at the next big tobacco, which I, as a pediatrician, certainly don't want to see, because right now, vaping aside, we're at the lowest level of cigarette use in the United States among high school students as well as adults. So in Washtenaw County, only 10% of adults are smokers now. Compare that if you went back to the 40s, 50s, 60s, we'd have 50% use. And adolescent cigarette use is very low. But unfortunately, we've lost all that ground that we gained on cigarettes by ready availability of nicotine products, vaping products. Likewise, you've seen the numbers for cannabis are rising, and we're at risk for really letting these great-looking, exciting products here into the developing brains of children and adolescents. So this is some pretty amazing data here, and I do have a reference for you on the next slide, but this is United States sales, cigarettes, $77 billion. Illicit cannabis, $60 billion. It's not far behind. And when you add in legal, recreational, and marijuana cannabis, 80 million. So, or 80 billion. It exceeds cigarettes in the United States. Not surprising, I think. It's well ahead of craft beer, the National Football League, frozen pizza, and tequila. And then how is that divided here? And this is our reference here, the visual capitalist. So flowers and pre-rolled cigarettes, about 50% of it. Another third goes to cartridges and concentrates. So this is different ways of concentrated products that can be ingested or smoked. And then edibles right now makes up about 9% of the market. Again, topicals, other products, relatively low use. All right, so now I think I do want to talk about health effects next, but before that, let's just see if there's any questions from the audience or online about sort of biology, a little bit about the marketing, and we're going to talk about risks next. Yes?
I understand that cannabis is being ordered for people with movement disorders, having a lot of success with bradykinesia and tremors. So that's Parkinson's, MS.
Yeah, so the question was, there is more use of cannabis for movement disorders, and I do think it has the potential to be beneficial. Again, it's not medicine at this point, but I think that's definitely something that's being studied because it is highly involved in coordination between the areas of the brain that involve coordination as well as executing coordination. So not my area of expertise, but it has promise. Yes?
The slide that you showed us.
Sorry.
The slide that you showed us had the, and I can't say the word.
Anandamide, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And that they can slide into areas of the brain. So they just find an empty spot and slide in. So our brain has capacity to accept a lot of these different things?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so a lot of whether it's cannabis, heroin, cocaine, the brain has receptors. It has places like a lock and key where the chemical goes and it turns on that activity. And it usually mimics something else, only to a stronger degree that's already in the body. So the brain gets reward from food. And these chemicals might hijack the food pathway, the same reward that you get, like you get a sugar buzz from eating some ice cream. Some of these chemicals might give you a buzz in the same pathway, only 10 to 100 times as strong. And your brain says, I like this, I want more, just like ice cream.
So how do they know where to go? I mean, do they sort of seek and hit?
Yeah, they're just delivered by the bloodstream. So if you get the smoking is the fastest way to get these drugs into your bloodstream. It's faster than injecting the drug, actually, because it goes right to the brain as opposed to through the liver if you inject it. So the fastest way to deliver a drug is to smoke it. It goes to the brain. It's delivered, through the bloodstream. I'm really glad you asked this question. And activates your brain's natural receptors. So nicotine's another great example. Nicotine's one of the most reinforcing drugs. The brain loves nicotine, and it increases alertness, makes you feel better, and the brain has receptors for nicotine. It wants nicotine. There are chemicals in your brain already that are like nicotine.
And is that not one of the hardest addictions to overcome?
Yeah, nicotine is definitely one of the hardest. And part of that is because of the way it's delivered. Because when you smoke it, you get an immediate effect. And if you think about a cigarette, it's a really good delivery system. And every puff is like, it's like a press on the lever if you're a rat, or an injection if you were injecting drugs. So, each cigarette, even if you only puffed it 20 times, that's like 20 times from that one cigarette, you're getting drug delivered to your brain. And if you think about 20 cigarettes in a pack, you're talking about 400 times a day at least that you're using it. So add on to that vaping, even more potent, more delivery. Yeah.
So trying to fight something like that, an addiction like that, is very, very difficult.
Super hard.
And is it compounded? Is it more or less more difficult if marijuana is involved, or is it the same as?
Yeah. So marijuana is probably not as rewarding as nicotine, for example, but everybody's different, and so that's a good segue into our next section, actually. So let's look at some of these biological consequences here. So, the vast majority of people who use marijuana are not going to have a problem with it. And so there's a spectrum from use, people who smoke it and they like it, or sometimes they don't. And then some people are going to develop a problem. So what is a use disorder? So probably about a third of people who regularly use marijuana are going to have some kind of a problem with it. And about 10% of regular users are going to have dependence. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but that's a serious problem. So a use disorder is some degree of problem. Dependence is more severe. And the risk of dependence is much greater if you start younger in life. I think it makes a little bit of sense, but your brain is still developing, and we'll show you a little bit more about that. So early use becomes problematic more likely. And so about 17% of people who start using marijuana in their teens are going to develop dependence. And by dependence means they can't really stop it without professional help, and even with professional help, they might not be able to stop it. And when you do stop using, if you are dependent on it, it's pretty unpleasant. And you feel terrible, you can't sleep well, your appetite's bad, you might be very nauseated, restless. And when you're feeling that way, hey, if I just take one puff, I'm going to feel better. And it becomes a vicious cycle where it's very hard to stop. So our best guess is about 10% of people who are regular users are going to have serious problems. How does that compare to alcohol? It's actually pretty similar. For alcohol, regular alcohol use throughout the world, if you go to a country where alcohol is readily available to the population, about 10% of people are going to have a serious problem. Now, the abuse of alcohol varies widely by country, or even within a country. So if you go to the Upper Peninsula in the winter in a college town, it's really high. You go to a dry county in Arizona, it's really low. The number of alcoholics is going to be the same, 10% of the population, but the misuse is going to be different. So society has a big impact on that, and we'll mention that near the end. So this is a picture of Nora Volkow. She's the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. She's a really interesting person. She's done more to advance our knowledge about addiction as a brain disease than probably any single person. She did a lot of the pioneering work in brain imaging. And she has great talks on, you can see them on YouTube or go to the NIDA website. A lot of good stuff on tobacco as well as cannabis. It's good to watch it with the subtitles because her accent is pretty thick. It's a really interesting combination. She grew up in Mexico of Russian descent. Her grandfather was Leon Trotsky. And so she's got a really unique accent, but a really brilliant person. So addiction is a disease of decision-making. It's the new neocortex you're continuing to use despite harm. And that's what the DSM-5, this is, sort of the psychiatrist's manual of how do we diagnose a problem. So when it comes to use disorders, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, heroin, cocaine, we have this same framework for thinking about it. And these are the big buckets here. You've lost control of the use. You're doing stupid things that you wouldn't have done prior to your use, like you go to the liquor store to buy alcohol when you should be picking up your kids from the rain and lightning at the soccer game. I had one dad who that was the deciding factor that he needed to get help for. So whatever drug it is, you've lost control, you're using it to the point where if you stop using it, you feel terrible, and you're having consequences. Those could be health consequences, they could be social consequences, whether it's work or family, and you're neglecting obligations in life. And that can happen with marijuana. Does it happen more with marijuana than alcohol? No. But 10% is not an insignificant part of the population. So Nora Volkow, again, if you see her name on a paper, it's worth reading. So she's the lead author on this paper, which is a little bit old, and the Institute of Medicine has a newer paper, but I think this one summarizes the adverse health effects pretty nicely, and it's available in the public domain, so all you gotta remember is Volkow, New England Journal, June 5th, 2014, and it'll take you to this table here. So if you remember when we looked at that picture of where the different brain receptors are for marijuana, if you look at the short-term use and what are its effects, impaired memory, so that's the hippocampus, lots of hippocampus receptors, your memory is going to be impaired, making it difficult to learn and retain information. Impaired motor coordination, which can affect your driving and increase your risk of injury. Altered judgment, which can increase your poor decision-making and lead you to things like risky sexual behaviors that can facilitate sexually transmitted diseases. And in high doses, paranoia and psychosis. So that's what we see with some of these synthetic marijuana products or some of these high-dose products. People can become acutely paranoid, they can become psychotic, they can wind up in the psychiatric hospital. For some people, it just unmasks they were going to have schizophrenia anyways, and they just develop it acutely. Maybe they would have had a different trajectory, though, if they hadn't had the marijuana exposure. And then with long-term heavy use, we already talked about addiction, problems with brain development, educational outcome, reduced IQ for those who are long-term users. So that's the cognitive impairment function. Diminished life satisfaction and achievement. I've got another slide on that one. Chronic bronchitis, and then, again, more risk for psychosis or even depression. So these are some of the links here. Again, it's hard to know cause and effect, but psychosis, anxiety, depression, all greater in people who use marijuana than the general population, probably greater for people who use more potent products. There's definitely data that shows using marijuana increases your risk of going on to have problematic use with other drugs like alcohol, nicotine, other drugs. And the psychosis risk may be greater for people with certain genetic variants, so we're learning more about that in the last few years. Just a couple more slides here. Now, this is actually kind of an interesting study that just shows long-term consequences for adolescent
cannabinoid exposure and what happens in adults. So there's emerging evidence from both humans and animals that early onset marijuana has long-lasting consequences on cognition, i.e. IQ, brain function, and a twofold increased risk of developing psychotic disorder. And I like this sort of definition of cognition here, the ability to orchestrate thought and action in accordance with goals. And that's when you really know when somebody's got an addictive problem, their goal isn't to be dependent on the drug. They didn't intend for that to happen, but their goal is no longer aligned with what's happening because the drug use has taken over their cognition. Now, this is kind of an interesting paper here. It's thought-provoking in that cannabis use, whether you're currently using or whether you gave it up as an adult, was associated with poor quality of life. And also current cannabis use adversely associated with employment. Now, again, there could be other reasons for that, like drug testing, but nonetheless, if you look for other behavioral factors, it's not significant. So is it the cannabis or is it the fact that you've got a bad life and you're smoking cannabis? It's worth thinking about. I mean, it's not just the drug itself, but it's also the environment as well. And we're going to talk more about that interaction as well. A couple more medical things to think about here. If you aren't aware of this phenomena, the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So everybody thinks of cannabis as being something that's really great for nausea, and it helps with people who are nauseated, whether it's in pregnancy or chemotherapy. But there are a substantial proportion of people who become persistently sick from it. So they have vomiting that they experience as a result of their cannabis use. They have persistent nausea. The one thing that they find relief from this is if they take hot showers. So somebody who says, I've got this persistent nausea, the only thing that relieves it is hot showers. We see this a lot. We tell people it's the cannabis. They tell us we're crazy. And I've had more than one person, literally, they're in the emergency department, so sick that they came to the emergency department. We tell them what's going on, and they think we're crazy, and they leave. And I've had this happen, not just to me, but I've had colleagues. I have a resident, I remember he went to a place in North Dakota. I said, you're going to see this there. There's a lot of cannabis use there. And he called me, 2 weeks after he got there, said, yep, I just had the first patient leave. So it's, just incongruent for the person to think that this could actually be making me worse. And then what about pregnancy? There is not great observational data, and there's certainly no randomized trials to say what happens with people who use marijuana in pregnancy. But I think we can say that there is definitely the possibility of fetal physical and brain development changes that might have an effect on attention, memory, problem solving, and behavior. It shouldn't be surprising. Nicotine has a profound impact on the risk of attention in kids as old as the 7th grade. So fetal exposure to nicotine makes kids more likely to have problems with attention. We all know the effects of fetal alcohol. How could cannabis be safe, right? There's plenty of risk, and there's no known benefit, of course. So this is the last Nora Volkow one, and I think if you are really interested in the brain disease model of addiction, this paper, again, is publicly available. But this is the very last paragraph from the paper, and I think it's worth seeing, which is, early voluntary drug use, if it goes undetected and unchecked, the resulting changes in the brain can ultimately erode a person's ability to control the impulse to take addictive drugs. So what we're talking about here really is an interplay between your biology and the environment being what's the cultural environment that allows exposure to these drugs, and then how does that impact with the brain and lead to addiction? And the thing that overplays this is, of course, brain development. So depending on when the brain is exposed, there may be a much, much greater impact. And when we think about brain development, the brain matures from the rear to the front. So the cerebellum, the coordination area of the brain, that's what toddlers are all about. They're learning to walk. The next part of the brain is motivation, reward. You think about, the kid who gets their first taste of ice cream or icing on a birthday cake and how that's so exciting, and they wonder where you're holding out. Like, why did I get this just now? And where do I get more? And then emotion, of course, this is a long process to develop. And this begins in the teenage years. It doesn't really solidify until much, much later. So exposing brains who are emotionally immature to these drugs, it's going to have an impact on emotional development. Finally, judgment, decision making. This is the newest part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, isn't finally myelinated until the age of 25. So, like the national tobacco 21 laws, I'm really happy about that. If it was me, I'd make it 25, but the same should be true really for all controlled substances. We should try as a society to keep drugs away from developing brains. Sapolsky, a brilliant Stanford neurobiologist, as well as a primatologist here, talks about the frontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing. And again, this is what ultimately gets impacted by drug use. So again, there is a genetic interplay here along with environment, and the environment can be confusing. Is this Mackinac fudge or is it marijuana fudge? I don't know. When I see a shop go up in Ann Arbor and it says cookies on it, I now know, it's probably going to be a marijuana shop. So we've really created hostile environments here for developing brains. One where the allure of cannabis, half the billboards are about cannabis, and it makes it look like that's kind of fun. Certainly not harmful, doesn't scare me, or if a nice building goes up now, I know it's probably going to be, a cannabis shop. So here's some public health concerns as we're transitioning here towards the end of the talk, some things to think about. So there's an organization that I think you were thinking about, who has a smart approach to marijuana. There's an organization called Smart Approach to Marijuana where they really have an excellent panel of both politicians as well as scientists on their board, and are really trying to look at a scientific basis for decision making. So Smart Approach to Marijuana. So it's learnaboutsam.org. And one of their contentions, which I think we can all agree with, is more stoned people doesn't help society. Other public health concerns is we know marijuana impairs coordination. People are out driving, and it's not easy to measure, like, how are you impaired? There's no blood alcohol level equivalent of marijuana. We can't really measure that. There's increasing use of marijuana in pregnancy. People are recommending it for nausea, and we know it's not good for developing fetuses. And then finally, legalization, there's a lot of talk about it resulting in better social justice. Now, we are going to make a distinction between legalization and decriminalization. And in fact, in areas where it's legalized, it really just is playing into the hands of disadvantaged communities are the ones who are getting to use this product, but it's not helping. And in fact, places like Colorado, black kids are still getting arrested way more than white kids for drug use, even though marijuana is, quite decriminalized there. So legalization doesn't really address the root issue, which is these drugs are targeted towards disadvantaged populations. I mentioned cigarettes. Only 10% of Washtenaw County adults smoke. 15% of African Americans in Washtenaw County. So disadvantaged populations get targeted by these big interests. And what we're seeing in places where the marijuana market is more developed is that just like the bigger producers buy out the smaller ones, and we're just trending towards bigger tobacco, bigger marijuana. And the big tobacco industries have a lot of vested interest in the success of marijuana as well. They're invested as well. So when we look at our regulations, federally, oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Yeah.
Thanks. I was hoping you'd touch on secondhand smoke exposure, because between between
Yeah.
when you're a fetus and you're adult, if if you're not smoking but
Yeah.
it's in your household,
Yeah.
we know what secondhand tobacco does. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. So the question is secondhand smoke. And I have relatively little to say about it because it has been poorly studied. But cannabis is a fairly dense particulate product, so there's a lot of particulate matter in there. So it does have the potential to have a lot of respiratory effects as a secondhand drug because a lot of those particles are going to wind up in the air. And so chronic bronchitis is associated with chronic use for smokers as well as people in the household. Marijuana does increase the heart rate quite a bit and can be a risk for worsening cardiac problems, but in terms of secondhand smoke, we don't know whether that does as much as not. Likewise, as a carcinogen, probably not as big an issue. So it's probably, other than for the person who has chronic lung disease, it's probably safer than tobacco in many other ways.
They're not getting the THC.
Right. Yeah. It's right. Even in a car, that's closed up, because we do have people come in and say this THC is, because I was in a closed space. It's like, yeah, no, not really. Yeah, Charlie.
Two questions.
Sure.
One, the patients with psychiatric problems are heavy smokers.
Yes.
Now, do you think the psych issue causes, which is the chicken and the egg there?
Right.
And in places like the University Hospital, there's no smoking, but these people need, they quote, need it.
Yeah.
The second question is cancer with cannabis.
Yeah.
Is that being studied now, the potential, and head and neck cancer, which is my interest?
Yeah. So the first question was smoking and psychiatric disorders. So when it comes to nicotine, again, nicotine is a molecule that people like, and from a psychiatric standpoint, definitely is calming, and also has some antidepressant effects if you're already on it. So now we have nicotine patches, gum, lozenges. We use them all the time. When it comes to cannabis and psychiatric illness, I think, again, it can be calming. And if you're using it on a regular basis, it's going to ameliorate some of the withdrawal that you'll have. Are there potential benefits from a psychiatric standpoint? Maybe, we'll see. And in terms of cancer, relatively little suspicion that cannabis causes much in the way of cancer. So certainly heart disease can be accelerated, but probably not created by cannabis use, and respiratory disease for sure. So let me do just a couple things on regulations, then I want to get us talking about where do we go, what are the solutions. So in terms of federal law, I already told you, cannabis is not legal and has no recognized therapeutic use, and I think that's a problem. I don't think it should be in that same category, that we should be able to do research with it and better understand what are the potential benefits. So, and of the other drugs that I mentioned, they fall into the category from Schedule 2, which is available by prescription. Dronabinol, that's the one for seizures, that's Schedule 3. And then Epidiolex is another nausea drug. So relatively easier to prescribe, but all controlled substances, which is reasonable. Now, when it comes to state laws, wide variation. And I think these are some of the founding principles for how states vary this. Do we legalize it, so make it like tobacco, alcohol, or do we just decriminalize it where it's not legal, but you're not going to jail for it? And then expungement is the idea that if there are people who have past criminal records based on marijuana laws that have been updated, can we clear their records? So these are things that vary across states, and so it leads to really uneven justice across the United States. And then state medical laws vary in terms of what is medicine and what isn't, and what kinds of formulations are available. And then many states, they may have a state law, but local regulations may vary. And then, of course, drug driving is another thing that varies a lot across state. I think Michigan has a somewhat reasonable approach here in that, there's regulation of production, so people are going to, if they are purchasing recreational marijuana, it's going to have some degree of control to it in terms of impurities. We literally have people who die from smoking what they think is marijuana. It's laced with fentanyl, and they die, or they have serious brain injury from periods where they stop breathing. So, legal recreational marijuana eliminates that. And again, after the age of 25, people are using recreational marijuana. They're probably not at great risk for causing problems if they don't already have problems. So it's really, again, about protecting developing brains. So production regulated in Michigan. Legal marijuana, again, it's still a relatively small, like only probably 1 out of 5, like 20% of the marijuana that's sold in Michigan is probably in the legal market. So there's still a big illegal market for it. And then there is this concept of medical marijuana in Michigan, which again, as most physicians, and certainly in addiction, we call it voter-approved marijuana rather than medical marijuana, because there's not much medicine to it, and it creates a whole nother area of regulation that is undertaxed as a result, because that's the advantage. Why people want the medical is because the taxes, they don't pay a tax on it. And then there is an effort to make people who have been in communities that have been traditionally harmed by marijuana laws, make it readily available to them, or more available in terms of lower taxes. I'll leave that to policy people to talk more about. So finally, what should our community response, again, and my focus here really is about developing brains, and I think if you've read anything by David Foster Wallace, he's a brilliant author, but also a troubled man who killed himself. And I think this is a really great description of adolescence here. The single most stressful and frightening period of human development, the stage when the adulthood we claim to crave begins to present itself as a real and narrowing system of responsibilities and limitations. When we yearn to return to childish oblivion, we pretend to scorn. Yep, I think he says it right there, yeah. Now, again, talk has been about marijuana, but I do think we have lessons to learn from nicotine, which is nicotine is actually a horrible drug for developing brains. And we've really lost a lot of ground in terms of nicotine because we allowed vaping and vape shops, and adolescent brains are getting exposed every day to this drug, which actually primes your brain to like stimulants like amphetamine and cocaine more. So it's no surprise that the use of stimulants and amphetamine is on the rise in the United States. Now, Iceland, interestingly, has a pretty interesting model where, again, it's a small country, it's only 500,000 people, but they had the highest levels of alcohol and tobacco use in Western Europe back in the 90s. And as a society, they decide, hey, this is not good for developing brains to be exposed to these chemicals. Just like drugged driving isn't good and stoned people isn't good, Iceland decided, yeah, this is not right. So they got parental involvement, and they got after-school activities for kids, basically. There's something for every kid to do, no matter what their socioeconomic status is, and they really targeted the most at-risk kids. And then the data is really striking in terms of, within 10 years, they went from the highest levels, 40% of kids that were regularly getting drunk after school, and 13% of kids that were using hash, down to, they cut things in half within a 10-year period. And now they're the lowest level of teen alcohol and tobacco use in Western Europe. So they went from the highest to the lowest in a relatively short period of time. Very different society than the United States, much more homogenous, but nonetheless, it's a good model. And so when we think about that, again, what can we do as a society to protect developing brains? That should be our goal. And of course, early childhood education and development has a big impact on kids' likelihood of using drugs in adolescence and high school. So, fortunately, Michigan is actually pursuing this pretty aggressively right now in terms of childhood education and development, and I hope that you'll all support it. Likewise, education should improve, wellness and adapting to the environment that we're living in. So, how to deal with social media and how to live with social media without letting it destroy you. And then supporting sober environments. So as an example, college campuses are getting better at this, but it's still got a long way to go where there's actually some opportunities for kids who go to college, if they have a problem with alcohol, to not be immersed in a alcohol-drenched environment. Decreasing access. So nationally, the Alcohol 21 had put the United States in a position that is actually better than a lot of countries, even Western Europe. Kids drink more in Europe than they do in the United States, and our national 21 law is part of that. Now, kids in the United States drink and drive, which they don't do in Europe, and so there's still a lot more consequences from our use. But nonetheless, Tobacco 21 is a good start. We really need it to be nicotine 21, so people really shouldn't be able to get nicotine until after, ideally 25, but I'll settle for 21. Taxes do have an impact on adolescent use, so they're much more price sensitive. Once you're an adult or you've got some money and income and you're using on a regular basis, you're going to pay the tax. But high taxes on whether it's cannabis, nicotine, alcohol does have an impact on adolescent use. And then zoning is something, the more outlet availability for whether it's liquor, nicotine, cannabis, use goes up wherever there's outlet availability. We have pretty unrestricted availability in Washtenaw County right now. And then obviously we need better support for mental health and substance use treatment. And I think decriminalization is important. You can decriminalize without doing anything from a legal standpoint. In fact, Portugal has made all drugs are decriminalized. So they put all their money into getting treatment for people rather than trying to have police intervention. And they really have compassion for people who are using and try to get them help rather than waste time in the legal system on this. And no surprise, Portugal has the lowest rate of drug use in Western Europe among adults. And it's the only country where everything is legal. They really put the resources into treatment there. And then the final thing here is marketing. Marketing is what we do in the United States. And so that's our problem, is we make it look like this is something everybody wants to do. And unless we really address that, we're not going to flip that curve with the perceived risk and the use. We really have to get people to perceive that this is not a good thing, which, again, Iceland was successful in. So I think, Mary can always make these slides available. I did mention SAM, which is the organization which I think has a really good approach for marijuana use. The county health department has some good health fact sheets which are available, National Institute on Drug Abuse. And then, the Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. So this is really, a national NIH, National Institute of Health has a branch that looks at what do you need to know, and they are aggressively looking at what are the potential benefits. And they're really, again, it's a lot of hype, but there is not a lot yet that we see in terms of benefits from cannabis. And I mentioned too that this is the more recent paper than the Nora Volkow paper on the health effects of cannabis, but I still think the Volkow paper, the older paper, is a better one here. So I will entertain questions. Yeah. All right. We haven't heard from you yet, so I'll start.
I went to a continuing ed class a few years ago from a substance abuse counselor, and he said that for people with schizophrenia, that marijuana was nearly as bad as LSD. But something that you said earlier made me wonder if you would agree with that.
It's hard to say. I mean, there's there aren't any randomized controlled trials. That's, in medicine we live by, where you take people with schizophrenia and you give them either, marijuana or no marijuana. Even, that's the problem with doing the research, even controlling like THC exposure. How do you do that? And is there other chemicals in there that might be helpful? Because THC is probably not going to be the most helpful thing. So as an addiction specialist, patients who have substance use disorders, they tend to do poorly with marijuana, but not all the time. Everybody's different. Some people, it's fine. And it's just like some people, heroin is going to be a big problem for them. Other people, it's not going to be the same. So I think I wouldn't paint broad brush strokes about what marijuana would do to a specific population. Yeah. At one of the resources ones, or
Going back to that whole genetic thing, if one of the parents, if parents have a gene, is the genetic disposition toward addiction or toward a specific kind of addiction?
Right. Yeah. There probably are. So it can be both, actually. So you can have a genetic predisposition for impaired decision-making, period. Or you could have one where you're more likely to like a certain drug, or maybe different kinds of drugs. And it's quite complex, and it usually involves other factors as well. So eating disorders might also follow in the same lines as a drug addiction as well, because the brain gets rewarded from maybe food, certain kinds of food. The brain gets rewarded by drugs, and that may actually be part of the same pattern. So it's many, many genes, and probably at best, genes would account for less than half of the likelihood that you'd use something. But half is still a lot.
Half is still a lot. So if one parent has a genetic disposition toward alcoholism, it's the father of the family. So one of the children of that family could possibly have that same genetic disposition toward alcohol, or is it a combination of nurture nature type of thing?
Yeah, it's definitely a combination of nurture and nature. So, since we say in general 9% of the population's at risk, you'd think, well, if a parent has it, does that double their risk, make it 18? No, probably just moves it up a few percentage. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
General question about the various different things that we've discussed today, the alcohol, smoking, and addictive drugs of one sort or another, and cannabis. Of all these things, which is taking the most from our society, and from the health of our people?
Well, when it comes to health, nicotine is probably clearly the biggest problem. If you look at, the top causes of death in the United States, so cancers, heart disease, other kinds of lung disease, tobacco is implicated in all of those, So tobacco is by far still the worst thing, and we still have, millions of people who are, they know it's a problem, but they can't stop. And why is it? Because they usually started when they're young. And, again, I am an addiction specialist, and I do a lot of work in a chemical dependency unit. I was at St. Mary's this morning. I got a guy who's 26 years old. He's getting treatment for alcohol use disorder. We've got him on nicotine patches. He's pretty comfortable, but he says, I'm going back to the first thing I do when I get out of here, I'm going to have a cigarette, because I've been smoking since I was in my teens. I smoke 2 packs a day, and I can't envision life without it. And again, he's only 26. Yeah, that won't do it. Yeah.
So I just had a question about cardiovascular disease and cannabis.
Yeah.
I've heard that there are some ways that cannabis can exacerbate the disease.
Right.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, probably the simplest mechanism that is well known is it definitely increases your heart rate. And so that alone, if you already have some cardiovascular disease, heart failure and heart attacks are always more likely to happen if you've got an increased heart rate. You're putting a stress on the heart. And so, yeah, worsening of heart failure and heart attacks. Yeah.
Does it also increase blood pressure?
So in terms of blood pressure is variable, it can, but not everybody, and it depends on how much you smoke. Some people, it does dilate blood vessels peripherally, which is one reason people, sort of get warm, or which could decrease blood flow to the heart because you're getting more blood flowing to other places. So blood pressure may or may not go up a little bit, and that can have an effect too, yeah.
How about atrial fibrillation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know about cannabis and atrial fibrillation. It's a good one. Be worth looking at.
I think education and marketing is so important.
Yeah.
And I love all this information.
I just wondered, how do we get the marketing to the right people? Like,
Yeah.
I don't think we are the people who, well, I'm not saying we don't
Yeah.
need to know this, we do need to know this, but do any of those organizations have some kind of youthful videos or outreach that you know of?
Yeah. There are organizations that do that. I think they've been more successful with tobacco, and the states that have the lowest adolescent tobacco use tend to be the ones that put the most money into adolescent tobacco prevention. Florida actually being a particularly good example, and I think it's something to think about with, what can we do as push legislators for put more of the tax money that's going into this into youth prevention. Yeah, and it does have to be very clever marketing to get youth to buy into it.
Maybe some billboards.
Right. Yeah, great question.
So as of right now, it seems like, from what I get from what you were talking about, that vaping is one of the worst delivery systems as far as getting things fast into your system.
Yeah.
Do you see things on the horizon that are even worse than that?
Yeah, I don't. I can imagine. Now that you've mentioned it, I can imagine things worse than vaping, but I'm not even going to say them in public. So, I think for the foreseeable future, it's such a good system that I don't think we'll see. You'll see different variations, and why is ours better? It's faster, cooler, but I think they're all bad. Yeah, just very, very unfortunate that. And again, big tobacco drove nicotine and funded a lot of the Juul products, for example. It's funded by, the tobacco companies to get young people to use this potent nicotine product. And so they're still out there. Tobacco still has a lot of power. Yeah. All right.
Well, just as an example, one-person example as far as AFib goes, it was suggested to me that I might try CBD for sleep, to enhance sleep. And I did try an oil one time at a very low dose, and I had rapid heart rate and AFib.
Wow.
So, of course, I do have cardiovascular issues, so that was something that we didn't consider at the time, but I was very glad to know about it, and I would like to see more research done in that area.
Yeah, super interesting, since I usually am talking about adolescents and cannabis. I haven't thought about it, but I'm going to look into that. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. All right, well, I appreciate the opportunity to come out and see you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.